all of us now know a lot more about the situation in Israel and Gaza following these horrific attacks. One of the immediate consequences is clearly what was happening in the region, a sort of normalization of the relationship between Israel and its neighbors is not just on hold, but presumably unthinkable for many years now.
I'm not sure if it's many years. I hope very much that it won't be many years, because I profoundly believe that the only long-term solution to this is a regional framework for peace with a Palestinian independent democratic state alongside an Israeli state based on the 1967 borders, based on the Saudi Arab Peace Initiative. And I think it's really for Saudi Arabia to revive that with all the regional powers. I don't think it's many, many years. I'm very much hoping that there will be a consensus that this is the only way forward. I would just like to add, since you mentioned you learned a lot of new things from Noga, that I have been watching videos all morning of the evacuation of Sderot. So it is curious why the international media isn't picking up on this, because there are many interviews, as Noga alluded to, of residents of Sderot. It's a fairly big town that have been staying in their homes despite advice to leave, but today decided for various reasons, because the ground attack seems imminent, to leave, and they're mounting buses and they have no idea where they're going. And many other towns or villages have already been evacuated. So you've got a large part of Israeli population that have been living in hotels already for a week. So I just thought I should just highlight that it is just, as I said, curious that international media is focusing on certain aspects, but not on other aspects that are largely available. As you know, those videos are available to all.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more, and that's why I found that interview so compelling. What I find interesting about what you're talking about the prospect of peace, so there are two points. One is when I interviewed Major General Chip Chapman earlier, he made the point that one of the reasons the Egyptians won't let Palestinians evacuate through Rafah is that they loathe Hamas. Hamas is in league with the Muslim Brotherhood. They loathe the Muslim Brotherhood, or the government does. The idea of allowing Palestinian refugees into Egypt is absolutely off the table. Is that a plausible thesis?
Well, I think the problem, is a consensus that they loathe Hamas. I would concur with that. Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and I don't need to remind you of the history between the current government in Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood. But I do think that there'll be mounting pressure. There's been Israeli pressure and American pressure and massive international pressure on Egypt to open the Rafah border. And as more and more citizens are moving, more and more civilians from northern Gaza are being pushed towards Khan Yunis and towards the south. I mean, between Khan Yunis and Rafah, it's not there isn't that much. So I think there will be mounting pressure, international pressure on Egypt to open the Rafah border, and they will have to screen, who they're letting in and who they're not, and that's going to be very complicated. But what they don't want is they don't want to open the door to Hamas. And that's very clear.
Which is
they
they
would like to see Hamas wiped out in Gaza. It's their borders too. It's the borders in the north, as you know, with Israel, borders in the south with Egypt. So
this highlights the unbelievable complexity of Middle Eastern politics, that you've got effectively Egypt nominally not a friend of Israel, but actually sharing exactly the same aim as Israel. You mentioned earlier the role that Saudi Arabia could play in leading the normalization, your hopes that would happen. I wonder whether I could ask you the thing about Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of Saudi Arabia. He's a great reformer. He's very young. He looks as an authoritarian, as it were, in control. But a lot of leaders in this region, to a certain extent, have to have a pact with their population. And is he in a position, really, after what has happened with the Hamas attack on Israel, and presumably one that unfortunately commands a great deal of public support among people in many countries around Israel, does he have the freedom to engage with Israel after this attack?
Oh, I think that the ongoing ties with Saudi Arabia are going to have to continue without a shadow of doubt. I don't see a peace agreement imminently, but there are certainly dialogues that will have to take place and will take place. I beg to disagree with you about Egypt not being a friend of Israel. I think Egypt, since it's signed a peace treaty with Israel, has been a very good friend to Israel, and they have extremely, extremely strong security ties. And they're in agreement, on Hamas. So I think it's very the relationship with Egypt, the security arrangement with Egypt, is very tight. And I think one has to distinguish between rhetoric that is for national consumption and what really goes on in private behind the scenes between leaders. The interest of Egypt is to have stability in the Gaza Strip. The interest of Saudi Arabia is to have stability there. So, and the interest certainly of Jordan as a neighboring country. So I do think that ties with Saudi Arabia will continue. I don't see a peace agreement, but I certainly see a constructive dialogue continuing.
And what role do you think Iran will play in the coming days?
Well, that would very much depend on what happens in Egypt. In Gaza. Sorry, I meant to say Gaza. And that would very, very much depend on the degree of escalation, the degree of civilian casualties. As you can see, Israel is waiting with a ground offensive to ensure that as many civilians are evacuating, because they've made it very clear that they intend to bomb and to bomb heavily in an unprecedented fashion. And as you mentioned correctly, the 3-hour, there's an extension after an extension after an extension for more civilians to be evacuated, because they would like to minimize the cost of civilian. But unfortunately, in modern warfare, you often get up to 90%, civilian casualties, collateral damage. This is not, we don't fight in the same way that the World War I and World War II were fought anymore. And avoiding civilian casualties is virtually impossible in Gaza, because the entire military infrastructure is underground, and it's underground intentionally underneath hospitals and schools.